There are couples who seem built for the spotlight, people whose love story appears so effortlessly perfect that the world simply cannot look away. For over a decade, Chip and Joanna Gaines occupied that rare space in American culture. They were the couple everyone rooted for, the team that made hard work look beautiful and marriage look easy. Fixer Upper didn't just make them famous. It made them feel like family to millions of strangers who invited them into their living rooms every week. But fame has a way of flattening the truth, of reducing complicated human lives into highlight reels. And behind the warm shiplap walls and perfectly staged farmhouses, a much more difficult story was quietly unfolding. One that would eventually bring fans around the world to tears. It started with something small, or at least it appeared small at first. Around early 2022, people who had followed Chip Gaines for years began noticing a shift in him that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The man who had always been the loudest person in any room, the one cracking jokes on demolition sites, bear-hugging strangers, and turning every stressful moment into a punchline, seemed to go quiet. His social media presence thinned out. Interviews became less frequent. The electric, almost exhausting energy that had defined his public personality for years appeared to drain away almost overnight. Fans speculated. Some assumed the pressures of running a growing media empire had finally caught up with him. Others wondered whether something had shifted inside the marriage itself. The silence felt uncharacteristic, and uncharacteristic silence from someone as publicly expressive as Chip Gaines naturally invites questions. What the public didn't yet know was that inside their home in Waco, Texas, Joanna was dealing with a physical condition that had been quietly worsening for some time. The kind of pain she was managing didn't arrive all at once. It built gradually, the way serious injuries often do in people who refuse to stop moving. Years of physically demanding renovation work, constant travel, pregnancy, raising 5 children, and the relentless pace of building a business empire had taken a serious toll on her body. At first, she managed it the way she managed most difficult things, quietly, privately, and without making a fuss. She continued filming. She continued appearing at events. She continued presenting the version of herself that her audience had grown to love and rely on. But the effort required to maintain that image was growing more costly by the day. Chip noticed before anyone else did. That's the thing about long marriages. The person who shares your daily life sees the truth long before it reaches the outside world. He saw the way she moved more carefully. He caught the flickers of pain she tried to hide in her expression. He noticed when the exhaustion she carried stopped looking like ordinary tiredness and started looking like something that wouldn't simply improve with rest. And, according to those close to the family, that knowledge changed him. The man who had always responded to every challenge with momentum and humor found himself facing something that none of his usual instincts could address. He couldn't outwork this problem. He couldn't joke his way past the fear growing quietly inside him. When Joanna's condition was eventually assessed by doctors, the diagnosis confirmed what the family had been privately dreading. She was dealing with a serious spinal condition, the kind that had been developing over years, and had reached a point where surgical intervention was no longer a choice, but a necessity. For a couple whose public identity had always been built around fixing things, transforming broken spaces into something whole and beautiful, this particular crisis carried an emotional dimension that went well beyond the medical facts. This was not a wall they could tear down and rebuild. This was not a foundation they could reinforce with the right materials and enough determination. This was Joanna's body, and all Chip could do was stand beside her and hope. The surgery happened, and in its aftermath, the life the Gaines family had constructed so carefully around work, cameras, and constant forward motion came to a quiet and necessary halt. Production schedules were rearranged. Public commitments disappeared. Projects that would have once seemed impossible to turn down were set aside without public explanation. From the outside, it might have looked like simple slowdown. From the inside, it was something far more profound. Chip stayed close to Joanna throughout her recovery. not as a television personality managing his brand image, but as a husband sitting with fear and doing the only thing available to him, which was refusing to leave. Friends who were close to the couple during this period described a version of Chip that his audience had never really seen. The performative confidence was gone. The constant need to fill silence with laughter had quieted. In its place was something more raw and more real. A man absorbing the emotional weight of watching his partner suffer while simultaneously trying to shield their 5 children from the anxiety radiating through the household. He was managing his own fear, managing Joanna's recovery, managing the children's emotional needs, and managing the quiet but persistent demands of a business that didn't pause simply because a family was struggling. The toll of all of that was visible to people who knew him well, even when he tried to minimize it. What made the situation resonate so deeply with fans, once pieces of it became public, was precisely how human it all was. Chip and Joanna Gaines had spent years being aspirational figures. Their marriage, their family, their business, and their aesthetic had all been held up as a kind of template for a life well-lived. There was immense warmth in what they projected, but there was also, inevitably, a certain untouchable quality to it. Nobody quite believed they had terrible days. Nobody pictured Chip sitting quietly in a hospital corridor, trying to hold himself together. But that image, once it started filtering through to the public through interviews, changed reactions, and visible emotional shifts, turned them from icons back into people. And people in the middle of genuine fear and love are always more moving than icons. When Chip began making public appearances again after the most difficult period of Joanna's recovery, the change in him was striking enough that fans immediately began discussing it online. He was calmer, more measured. The observations he offered in interviews had moved away from business momentum and expansion plans and toward something quieter: gratitude, perspective, the importance of presence over productivity. People who had followed him for a decade said he looked older, but not in a way that was simply about age. He looked like someone who had been somewhere difficult and returned carrying the weight of it. Some fans found that transformation heartbreaking. Others found it deeply comforting, because it reflected an experience they recognized from their own lives. The tenderness that became visible between Chip and Joanna during this period also moved people in unexpected ways. Their public dynamic had always been warm and affectionate, but it had also been playful, sometimes almost theatrical in its back-and-forth energy. What observers began noticing in the aftermath of Joanna's diagnosis and recovery was something different. The gestures were smaller and quieter. The way Chip positioned himself beside her, the attentiveness in his expression, the care with which he spoke about her. All of it communicated a depth of feeling that the banter and construction site jokes of their earlier television years had never quite revealed. It was the difference between watching people perform love for an audience and watching someone simply love another person without thinking about who is watching. This shift also prompted Joanna to speak more openly than she typically had about the emotional dimensions of their life together. She acknowledged how difficult it had been to balance the demands of a growing empire with the needs of a marriage and a family. She was candid about the ways in which even a relationship as solid as theirs could be quietly worn down by exhaustion, expectation, and the strange pressures of living publicly. The surgery and recovery had forced a kind of stopping that their lives had never really allowed before. And in that stopping, both of them had apparently found things worth holding on to more carefully: simple evenings at home, intentional time with their children, the ordinary rituals of a shared life that are easy to overlook when ambition is always accelerating. There was also a broader public dimension to what Chip and Joanna navigated during this period. Magnolia Network found itself at the center of a separate controversy involving programming that depicted a same-sex couple, drawing criticism from portions of their audience who felt it conflicted with the faith-based values the Gaines family had long represented publicly. The timing placed additional pressure on a family already managing an enormous amount privately. Chip's response to that criticism was notably different from how he might have handled similar controversy in earlier years. He spoke about empathy and compassion with a directness and seriousness that felt less like brand management and more like genuine personal conviction shaped by recent experience. People who had watched him closely felt the difference, even if they couldn't always articulate exactly what had changed. By the time 2025 arrived, the Gaines family had traveled a long way from the image that had first captured America's attention. The relentless expansion had slowed. The priorities had quietly reordered themselves. Older children were preparing for lives of their own, and the household that had once felt like an endlessly productive engine was learning the value of stillness. Chip spoke in interviews with a kind of reflective honesty about what the previous years had cost and what they had given back. He talked about the fear of nearly losing something irreplaceable. He talked about the way crisis has a clarifying effect, burning away everything that seems important until only the things that actually are remain visible. What Chip Gaines did after Joanna's diagnosis was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. He didn't deliver a speech or make a grand gesture that could be packaged into a viral moment. What he did was far simpler and, because of that, far more affecting. He showed up. He stayed. He put down the ambition and the performance and the endless forward movement that had defined his public self, and he just remained present beside the person he had built his life with. For millions of people who watched that unfold, imperfectly, privately, and across years rather than across a single emotional scene, it was more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of love story they had always hoped the Gaines family represented beneath the cameras and the carefully curated image. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about what Chip and Joanna have revealed through all of this. The renovation that mattered most was never a house. It was a marriage being tended to with patience, fear, sacrifice, and the quiet, daily decision to keep choosing each other, even when everything around them felt unstable. Fans were moved to tears, not because the story was tragic, but because it was true. And truth, in a world full of polished surfaces and managed impressions, is always the most unexpectedly powerful thing.